Greetings and welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and this radio show is paid for by Medgar Evers College. Writers on Writing comes to you each Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers talk about their work, their craft, and their lives. And I am the executive director and founder of the Center for Black Literature at Medgar Evers College and a professor of English here at Medgar Evers College. I am very, very pleased to have with me in this conversation today, W.B. Garvey. Welcome. And what should I call you?
WB is fine, Dr.
WB, yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. He has a book that's relatively new, Independence Blues. I want to share with our audience some background of W.B. Garvey. I've read each of his books and found them really fascinating and very different. He's a relative of the famous Pan-Africanist and Jamaican national hero, Marcus Garvey, which led to his personal connection with Marcus Garvey's widow, Amy Jack Garvey. And while going through his deceased father's papers, he learned that his grandfather had been a railroad engineer who worked on the Panama Canal during its construction. And that led him to fulfill his dreams of becoming a writer and led to the writing of White Gold and Panama Fever, Digging Down Cold Mountain. So this new novel, Independence Blues, draws on his early life in Los Angeles and stories of his parents in the United States and Canada from 1946 to 1963. I'm going to stop there. I am going to add that WB is a classically trained violinist, and he's performed as a soloist with renowned symphony orchestras. And so one of the things I saw in this book was that it does give more of who you are. In your previous books, you were telling the stories of your ancestors and those who had been involved in the Panama Canal, while also giving us a critical landscape for which to view what happened to so many Jamaicans during the building of the Panama Canal and the family. So you got a real sense, a real insider's look at that. And I think that was part of what was really interesting, because we don't normally get that. But I'm going to stop talking and ask you to just share with our audience what motivated you to write Independence Blues. And as I said, it is a book that as I was reading, I continued to look for the chapters. And so let's start there.
Yeah, it sort of seemed like the natural continuation of my work, because as you said, I was sort of tracing my family's experience as immigrants, working first on the Panama Canal and then, of course, in this country as well. And I spoke about my grandparents. And I thought my parents' experience as immigrants was not the same, but also shared some of the qualities that I'd like to get into, which is what the immigrant experience is seen through the eyes of someone who comes from the African diaspora, and how the difference between colonialism and American racial caste systems, bring out different aspects of what that means for each individual. I'm very interested in that because I feel like I'm a dual national in a way, because although I was born in Los Angeles, I spent my formative years in Kingston, Jamaica. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is that I wanted to share that sort of dual consciousness that I have. Du Bois talks about the dual consciousness that Americans have. And then when you're an immigrant on top of that, and you're coming from some of an English colonial background, and then you grow up in this country and then have to deal with that country and try and merge the two personalities that you present to the world. I know a lot of people share those sort of conflicts and sort of complex backgrounds, and I wanted to explore that through my own experiences.
Right. I think you did a really good job of giving us a very vivid description and details of what it was like to be in Jamaica And then, of course, seeing through the landscape of the narrator, the young boy, which is, symbolically you, the unraveling of the family dynamics, the race. She brought in so many issues. So in reading it, it felt as if it almost felt like a stream of consciousness, which which gets me into why you chose not to use chapters.
That's exactly right. This is what pleases me when my intention actually gets appreciated. I wanted the whole idea to be a journey, right? It's a journey, and it's not just where you are physically. It's where you are historically, and where you are currently, and where you're going towards the future. And there's no way to sort of demarcate the Black experience because it's always evolving. And if I put a chapter in, the person's going to say, oh, well, that's complete. No, but it's never complete, right? And I had this discussion actually with a book club that I did a Zoom with them. They were all like, why don't you put chapters in? How can we, know where to start? And I was like, well, you're going to have to use, bookmarks and stuff, because you can use that even with Kindle. So I know it's unconventional, but there are other books that have done this. And I found when I read those books, I understood what the authors were after. And I was trying to sort of keep the journey as one idea, right? That you're always this person, but it changes no matter, it's sort of a geographical thing. If you notice in the journey as they go from the West Coast to the South and to every encounter is slightly different. And you see the intensification of the racial animus increase the further to the South you go. And the way you have to adjust that behavior. And my father, who had, gone to school in Louisiana and suffered from some of the more acute violent experiences you're confronted with, had a different approach than my mother,
yes,
who went to New York and then went to California. So she had a different understanding of the experience than my father did. And that was one of the real bases of their eventual split, was that she loved California in particular. She loved the opportunities that for a woman did not exist in Jamaica. And she felt as if she had a much brighter future here, while my father, who was very successful in Jamaica, saw his whole sort of self-image not slightly, but actually crumble over time. So I wanted to contrast those two things. Another reason why I didn't put chapters in is because I wanted the reader to understand that this was an evolution through, that period that you described from 1946 to 1962.
It's an evolution, but it's also, I think, indicative of how we think and how we move in this world. Because as we are moving along this journey that we call life, we do have these flashbacks. We go back to our childhood. We go back to even our parents. And then we're dealing with the contemporary issues around us. And we're dreaming, we're imagining a different future. So it really was, it seemed as if it was an attempt to mirror what the mind does.
Well, that's why I had it set through the young child, because that's the only thing he has is what he's learned through his parents and what he sees around him. So I wanted to bring to him the understanding that these things have a root, and throughout the whole thing I talked about stream of consciousness, like he's growing into the understanding because the world is starting to make sense, and all those things that my parents went through in their lives contribute to his education. And that's for all of us, right? We, like you said, we draw on our parents' experience, our own experience, and we're constantly trying to make sense of who we are in relation to others. And that changes depending on how the society reacts to you and how they see your skin. Skin becomes so important in this society. So right. That's what I was trying to get at. And that your essence as a person, how you sense yourself changes. The essence of who you are doesn't change, but the way you view your perceptive person changes. If that makes any sense.
Yes. And then you highlight some of the conflicts, and this is also a critique of imperialism and colonialism. Was that something you thought about when you were writing this? I mean, we know that it's the racism, the systemic racial structures that are in America, but you also bring in these other conflicts that we deal with as that duality you talk about, being Black in both worlds.
Exactly, because the imperialistic system varies, and in this country it's very rigid in terms of where the way it operates is sort of like you're either with us or against it. You're either with the imperium or you're against it. In Jamaica, it was more subtle because they had a buffer class, which I talk about with my father particularly. There's this buffer class that if you're darker skinned, it's harder to get into. But you can move a little bit. I mean, the barriers are a little more porous because they keep this buffer class of what they call colored folks.
Yes.
Which are people who are generally, but not always, lighter skinned and have more education. But the idea, which I sort of try and put in at the beginning of the book, is that the idea that we're all imprisoned by this system. When I talk about the guy in the prison who has epilepsy.
Yes.
The idea
that
of
was
that
painful to read.
Well,
that was
intended, it was
yes,
intended to be painful to read, because I feel almost like the essence of the Black soul is entrapped in this prison. There are many people who thought that Jesus might have been an epileptic, which is why I made him an epileptic, and that he sees the whole thing, he sees the whole situation, and he's trying to tell his fellow prisoners, hey, we're all in this together. You're fighting over scraps here. And of course, there's no one that really understands him except my father, because my father has thought about a lot of these. My father was a very, I want to say, forward-looking man. He was very much into metaphysics. That'll give an idea of what I'm talking about. He didn't see race in the typical way we see race. It's interesting because his father was a Garveyist, and my grandmother on my mother's side, they were both Garveyists, and he definitely supported Garvey, but he didn't view race in the same way. He viewed race as what it is, an artificial societal creation. So while he supported the liberation movement, he was very concerned about the fact that Black people, their souls are getting, constrained by this system, and he didn't want that for me. He said, for you to be an artist, it's going to be very difficult, particularly in the world you've chosen, to operate in this system. Of course, this is before the 1965 Voting Rights Act and some of the changes that would happen later on. So in that sense, I think his vision was a little bit narrow, but on the other hand, a lot of the things that he worried about still exist.
Right. You also focus on the relationship between women, the mothers and the daughters and the other women. Was that reflective of what you saw growing up in Jamaica?
Absolutely.
And California?
Absolutely. In Jamaica in particular, because my mother went back, she didn't actually leave right away. She actually went back a year after we emigrated to Jamaica, and then she went back to the States. And eventually, my father went back to try and reconcile with her, and I stayed with my godmother in Jamaica for a few years. And she was a matriarch, and in fact, she was a matriarch raised by matriarchs, raised by matriarchs. Like that was like she was a third generation of a woman who ran the household, which was very interesting, because her husband worked in the railroad. And so he was often away, but she ran that house, and her mother had run the house and her grandmother had run the house. So I was used to, a sort of maternal domination, if you will, which is very West Indian too. So, and of course, within the political system, there wasn't any outlet for these women, and sort of for careers and stuff. They couldn't be doctors or lawyers, or they were pretty much confined to nursing, which is what my mother was. So a lot of brilliant women were very constrained in Jamaica as to what they could accomplish, even though they were, as I said, very, very powerful women. My grandmother on my father's side was a businesswoman. I mean, she was very high powered. So they all had that sort of conflict between trying to develop this society that was, post-slave, it's a post-slave society, at the same time, trying to give their daughters something to aspire towards, and it was always a challenge. Right. You married up. That's what you did.
Yes, you married up, and you married up in terms with skin color and education and class. Yes, right. Yes. So you were very deliberate about selecting certain books to have your narrator read. Do you want to talk about that? I thought it was, and I'm
Yeah,
looking at that with the title, Independence Blues.
yeah. Well, the all of the books I chose were ones that moved me as a child. So I picked those. It wasn't sort of any particular
Okay.
political statement I was making. It was ones that allowed me actually, when I think back on it, to make sense of what was going on. So I picked, for instance, Huckleberry Finn, because that book really struck me when I was reading it as a kid, because it was not like anything else I had read. And I remember thinking about Huck as being, when I reflected on what I experienced, as being this outcast. And I was like, okay, I'm starting to get that. And of course, there's Black Boy, which is, again, this idea that I'm inhabiting a body, but my mind is somewhere else. People are looking at me one way and I'm thinking something else. I'm exploring the world, and people want to keep me in this sort of limited. So it was always about, like I said, independence, trying to exist independent of what people expect of you. And that's always been the way I've operated. It's like, I don't want limitations. When people told me when I was little, you can't play the violin, you're supposed to play the trumpet, that sort of stuff for me. From then on, I was going to play the violin. That's just the way I was built.
Yes. Yeah. So, just saying people outside of the box, what does independence mean? So you're looking at independence from all of these different vantage points.
Exactly. It was both real in the sense that Jamaica had become independent in 1962. So politically, we're talking about, this was the beginning of the Black liberation, both in the West Indies, but in Africa and in India. So the independence covers political. And then there's independence in terms of social, women starting to move out of just being in the home and having the independence to have their own careers. And then there's the more interesting part of independence for me, which is the individual independence to steer your own ship, which of course is the most difficult of all, and actually ends up sometimes costing you your relations.
Right. So as I said, the concept behind this is really interesting. And I'd like you to share with us what your writing process was for this book. This is a different style. It's much more personal. What was your writing process for this book?
I went back and I tried to relive that journey. And what I did was I tried to remember every emotion I felt as a 9-year-old boy traveling across the country. And each time I would bump across a certain event, I would try and look at my parents' life and try and correlate that experience with something that they had learned, and to understand as I write how that experience they had would show how they reacted to it, and how they reacted to me, and how they reacted to, what they wanted to convey to me. So it was sort of like an excavation. Think of it as sort of archaeology, social archaeology. I'm trying to rebuild all the conflicts that I felt, because that journey, it was only 3 days, but it completely changed the way I not only viewed the world, but the way I viewed myself. If we hadn't taken that journey at that particular time, I don't think I would have been the same person I was later. So it was a matter of remembering and trying to figure out just how warped I got by that experience,
Right.
and how I managed to unwarp, whatever resentments I had built up as a result of it.
I imagine it would have been challenging to remember that, because you're doing this, as a grown adult. Did you keep a journal? I mean, how did you go about really
Remarkably,
reflecting
I
that?
remember details like they were yesterday.
Okay.
Don't ask me how, but I do. I can remember people, like the reporter that we met in. I can see him in my mind's eye. I can see all the characters. I never forgot them.
Okay.
Because it was, I don't know how to explain this. It's such a shock when you have a certain image of yourself. I was a doted on child, and to all of a sudden be, you can't stay here, or you have to sleep in the car, or you can't eat here, you can't use the bathroom. It was devastating to me. It was
Okay.
absolutely devastating. because it just shattered my whole self-image. It was like, okay, I'm not the person I thought I was. And so what I had to do was go back and say, all right, what happened to me during that period? And of course, a lot did happen to me, because shortly after I moved back to Jamaica, as it turned out, my godbrother had a brother who was quite a reader, and he was a James Baldwin fan. So I started to read James Baldwin, I think a year or two after I moved to Jamaica. And it was like all of a sudden I'm developing this whole different outlook on the world. And I guess that sort of helped sort of cement my experience, because I was really trying to figure things out. I was trying to figure out, what is this race thing all about? Because obviously I knew there was a difference. I mean, there's no question about that. But I didn't understand why it sort of colored everything. It was a bad pun. Why it colored everything. I didn't understand that, because, you know, my teachers, as I was transferred to a white school, they were mostly white, and they were kind and, you know, seemed interested and like normal people. And so it didn't dawn on me until, you know, that experience that no, you were not like your friends at school.
Right. You keep going back to that. So just switching up a little bit, who are the people you're reading? I think of writers being in conversation with other writers. Who are the writers you're reading?
Well, interestingly, right now I'm reading Gogol. You're going to say Gogol.
You're reading who?
Gogol, Gogol.
Oh.
He's a Ukrainian satirist, and the reason I'm reading him is because there's a history to that country that's now under siege that is very, very sort of, I wouldn't say it's a parallel, but it's interesting in that its relationship to Russia is like a colony, but it's also a place that's been conquered by a lot of other countries in that region. And as a result of that, you see a lot of the sort of political, racial, cultural issues that we in this hemisphere, in this particular country, face. And I wanted to get a sense of the history of that place, because everyone is talking about it all the time, and I wanted to understand it a little better. And so that interested me. But obviously, I read Yaya Ga, who wrote the great book on she's a neurosurgeon, and wrote about her Gayasi, and her experience as a neurosurgeon, and how she related that to her experience in Alabama growing up, and that also sense of alienation and that she feels. And of course, there's Americana, which is another a good book from an African writer talking about the fact that there are no Black people in Africa, right? So I try and keep up with as much as I can, but you know, it's there's stuff coming out all the time. I read Deacon Jones, the story of what's his name, John Brown, and I should put a list in front of me so I can remember all these books I read in the last week. But anyway, yeah, I try and read as much as I can, but I write also, so it's a big jumble in my head at the moment.
Right. So when you're reading, I say the writer's always reading, the reader's always writing. So when you're reading, you're continuing to write as you're reading.
At the moment, I'm not writing at the moment, but usually what I do when I'm writing is I will pause the reading. I tend to read a lot before I decide what I'm going to work on. So when I'm actually writing, what I'll do is I'll refer to books that I want to use for reference or to quote from. A writer I really like is Go Solo. Another writer is Richard Rodriguez. I try and keep these people in my consciousness, so that when I'm writing, I can go and refer to what it was that I remember having read, so I can apply that idea, that germ that's in the subconscious, to whatever issue I want to deal with. So when I'm dealing with race, for instance, and I want to give it a slightly different stance, I will go back and reread that. But I don't read, because when I read, I tend to read very analytically. So it's not, I don't, as a writer, probably you know this, you don't read for pleasure as much.
No,
You're
you're
always analyzing,
you're
all right, why did he
analyzing,
say this?
sometimes rewriting it.
Sometimes when it's not living up to your expectations, like, you know, I don't know if you read this book, Black Cake, but it's supposedly about someone who grew up in Jamaica, and they had this tradition of using the Christmas cake. They call it black cake in the book, and she used that as a metaphor. And I was like, wow, there's a lot here that, you know, I need to unpack, because it's a little different from what I experienced. So, you know, it's wonderful to see all these writers now, particularly Black writers, coming into their own, because, you know, when I was younger, that was just not available. So, you know,
right. So we
great.
are at a close. I'd like you, our readers, to go out and purchase Independence Blues. And I want to thank you, W.B. Garvey, for having this conversation with me. And they can also visit your website. You want to give your website?
Sure, it's www.wbgarvey.com.
Thank you so much for continuing to write, and you're always giving history as you're writing. And I want our listeners to remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. And this radio broadcast is paid for by Medgar Evers College. You should also visit the Center for Black Literature YouTube page at www.centerforblackLiterature. We will have this on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for sharing this time with us.
Absolute pleasure.